hey, Taras, I heard very good things about the plugin that you put out there. Actually, I heard so many good things that I stopped using Cursor in the last few weeks. On top of that, we talked with some people and they are actually not doing anything similar to it right now. Why don't we give them an example of how can you work with this kind of plugins, and we explain a bit of what you've been doing lately.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And actually with all the hype that these agentic coding tools are generating, especially Claude Code, it's super hot lately. And yeah, so I think like a great example to showcase what you can do if you kind of like control and know how you're using these tools is to develop a new feature for the AI tracker that we built. Let's super briefly introduce what this AI tracker is. The AI tracker is essentially a CLI tool that we built that has a set of commands. The most interesting one is the stats. The stats one, and actually I will put with the graph on, is a command that will automatically figure out how many lines of code the AI is actually implementing for the repos that you have, like that you've been working on, versus the lines that you're manually actually adding, right? And you can see here that we have like a set of repos. These are the repos that we're working at Desplega, and some like kind of like related or unrelated. And you can see some of them that are like more than 90% usage. Now, all of these, I don't think we need to go into the details of how that is implemented, but essentially what it's doing is getting all the tool calls that Claude Code is doing using a hook, and then comparing when those changes are committed with all the changes that actually come into that commit, and saying, okay, this file was last time edited in those lines by the AI, hence those are AI lines. Now, the algorithm might not be super accurate, but it gives you an idea of like how much AI code are you shipping locally.
So, okay, I like it, but why did you implement this tool? Well, can you tell us a bit of why you decided to do this AI tracker at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday?
Yeah, so actually one of the things that I've been really interested on, like lately, specifically as I spent more and more tokens in Claude Code, is okay, how is my development changing as I use these tools more? Now, by default, you don't really have visibility on like how much you use that tool, apart from like how much like of the weekly usage you're using, right? Like, okay, that gives you a super high level insight. If you're hitting those limits, you know that you're using a lot, but really like how much of that is materialized into the projects or products you're working on, right? And that was one of the motivations to build this tool, to understand better how much I'm using AI, and specifically how much AI I'm using in different projects. No, you can see here that some of them I use less than others, and it might not be like just a random thing. Like for example, in Desplega AI, which is the main repository where we work on the Desplega AI product, you can see that it's not 100% in comparison with some other tools, like literally this repository that contains AI tools that we built that are like related to what we're doing, but maybe not directly related with the product we're offering. It's much higher. No, in fact, like it's 98%. So most of the code is written by AI. Maybe that 2% is actually like just some lines that I deleted manually. I don't think I even like write proper code in here. And the same goes to other projects. Like this one, I remember that there was like some issue that the AI was struggling in, and I like helped it manually to figure it out, right? And that's probably why it's 90% and not higher.
Okay, I actually liked it a lot. I hear a lot of people that are talking about how good they are at using AI or how little AI is helping them, right? And they have this challenge on when you ask them how do you measure that, they really don't, right? And it's more of a feeling, which is kind of strange, at least for us. So I agree with this. I really like it. The problem I see with this is that I have the same thing running on my local, right? And we compare numbers and we share notes because we sit next to each other, but actually we don't have a holistic view of it, right? And we've been going back and forth about how we get that holistic view of it. So given that we're not going to recommend these to Agent Swarm to do on itself, you can check Agent Swarm and see a bit of what we're doing there. We're going to talk about it soon. Why don't we show a bit of how would be to build this remote functionality so that we can aggregate the results of this tool in your local host and mine?
Yes. So to do that, let's go through the typical life cycle that we go through to develop new features. Like this applies not only to this project, but generally it's what's been using across everything that we work on. So I just have Claude Code open here, and there's some plugins that we developed and we have installed by default, which I will just super fast like showcase. It's the Desplega AI Toolbox plugin that comes with some 5 plugins in particular. And the one that we will be using is this Desplega one. In particular, what we want to do right now is to go through an initial step of research on how the AI Toolbox project is implemented, which I can give you an insight. It's implemented on a local SQLite database. And it will go through other points on figuring out how we what can we do, what tools we can use, and so on, to implement whatever we want. In this case, what we want is a way to kind of like synchronize all this information across different devices. No, in this case, it would be between us, so that we can have a centralized place where we can see all these metrics together and see that. So for that, I will start a research through this command, and let's kind of like work on how we will prompt this research command. So we can be as like, it depends a little bit on what you want to do. Sometimes like one sentence or even a few words is enough. Sometimes you might want to write like a whole paragraph around it. But in this case, maybe what we can say is something like,
how often do you ask Claude to write the query that you're going to put here?
So this is an interesting point, actually. Let's do one thing. Let's write down this one, and while it works, let's talk about that point, because that's an interesting one. So to write down, I will say, I want to be able to centralize the data of the AI tracker project across devices. Hence, please research how we could do that. I'm fine deploying an API or something. Yeah. Actually, like, this should be enough to kind of like trigger it. The whole point here is that it will, how this skill in particular is done, and you can already see it here, that the first thing that it will ask is, what autonomy do you want in this research? And this is actually a pretty critical point, because depending on how much control do you want around this research, you can select if you want critical questions autopilot, which is literally like, autopilot would be the most similar thing to deep research that you would run on like ChatGPT or something like that. Verbose is the one that I like the most, even though like sometimes I go autopilot too, but I like it because I can control really well in which direction it goes, and actually will ask more questions, follow-ups, and so on before actually finishing up the research. So in this case, I will do an in-between, which I will say critical questions, pretty much because I think like I don't have a real idea of like how I want this to be implemented, so I don't really care about like controlling that research, so I will just keep it critical. And I think it might ask some more questions, but while it asks more questions to what you were saying about how much I use AI to write prompts for AI, one of the things that I found super useful is, if you see here on top, I have different projects open. And obviously this project, I could run a Claude Code like on my home directory. That's definitely an option. But in my case, how I like it is, whenever, for example, I develop a feature in project X and I know that project Y depends on it, what I do is kind of like a storytelling approach, in which I say, hey, you have just implemented this feature. I have a team that is working on like this other project that depends on the feature that you implemented. Could you write a spec or a little spec, a ticket, kind of like a description of what you've done, so that I can just pass it around to that team so that they can work on it? And that kind of like works pretty nicely, so that I can like use AI to figure out what it have done, figure out how to summarize that into a little kind of like description or ticket, and then I just like copy paste that into the other Claude session that I have running in the other projects. So that's actually something that has been working pretty well. Like especially this like storytelling approach, I think like that's pretty nice.
Nice. Actually, there's something happening there in the screen, right? Like there are two task outputs, and both of them start with research. Can you explain to me a little of what's going on there?
Yeah. So actually, this is one of the parts that are key of this kind of like / command that we're using here. That is, here on top you can see that it launched two agents. That is like the display a web search researcher. One regarding like SQL sync solution and simple API deployment options. So it figured out those two topics are worth researching. And if you can see here, my context right now is 36%. Now, what this means is that those two agents will be running in the background in parallel in their own context and with their own kind of like session and so on. And the output of those will be piped into my main session. And that's really important, because you want to kind of like keep your main session as clean as possible in terms of context. So you want to delegate as much of like background searches, or like even sometimes you might want to do the same for things like, okay, I want to like you have a test suite that there's a single test that is failing that needs to be changed. Probably it's worth to kind of like run that in the background, because probably what you're working on in the main thread might be like a feature. So like having the output of that test or like things like that in the main thread, it will pollute it a lot, and it will like eat a lot of that context, and it might force you to either like compact, which is something that we don't recommend, or like figure out ways to kind of like hand off the context, or find ways to essentially start over, clean that context, and continue. So that's one of the things that we try to do as much as possible. Sometimes the agent might not do that by default, and even if you prompt it, like in the end of the day, these are LLMs, and sometimes they are unpredictable. So you want to kind of like have a look at what it's doing, and if you want to reprompt it, do it, and so on. No? And you can see here that, for example, the API deployment options agent completed, and we are waiting for the SQLite sync one, which might take some time. I don't know, like maybe like a few seconds more or something like that. And yeah,
Actually, there are two learnings there that you mentioned very quickly, and I think it would be nice to iterate a bit on that. The first one is, even though you started with a single research, right? Actually, that research agent can span other research agents, right? So actually, it can go deeper into the directions that they want to, and that's something very important about the research process, right? The research process is open-ended, right?
Yeah.
Just before that, you also mentioned a bit about the storytelling that you use to generate those prompts that actually helps on that open-ended direction, right? And the final learning that I think is also very important is something that you were reminding us of is it's all about the context size, right? So having these sub agents that span automatically that are going to do research in specific areas, right? And as you're saying now, I can see that you have the two agents there, right? Actually, it's going to save us a lot of context. And even though we can see that you're consuming a lot in your account, right? At least it's not from that main context that you have right now for the single research that is now 60% once that you got those agents back. So I think those are extremely important learnings, right?
Yeah. And exactly. And right now, for example, it will be generating probably an initial draft of the research, which actually is pretty important because at that point you can think about it as a checkpoint. And regarding this kind of like context thing, that context control topic that you were mentioning, is at that point, if you have the process, you've been following a process, in this case it was a research, and you wrote down what you found in a file. Now that file is key because you can see here that it was requesting me to write it down, and I will say yes. At this point, I can completely kill Claude Code and say, okay, let's follow up on this research. And this is really important because all the things that it read and it did here, it will be in some way or another written down in that research. No? And here it's giving me a summary. And actually, here comes one of the interesting parts, which is the file review thing. The file review is a little tool that we built that its only purpose is to be able to have a really easy way to give feedback on files, so that feedback can be piped in again to the agent, and it can be like an interactive session of feedback. No? You can see here, I will zoom in a little bit, and I will put it in Markdown preview mode. You can see that this is the research that Claude generated. No, it has information like the date, whatever the researcher, the git commit. This is pretty important because this gives an idea of like when this research was done, not only in terms of time but in terms of commits. As you kind of like grow in your code base, or you have different collaborators, having this information is key, so that you know, okay, this information or this research, specifically the parts where it checks how the system works, which is this section that you can see the current architecture, which describes, okay, the data storage works like this is the database location, and then it starts with options. And also like there's a little summary, no? And what we will do now is actually have a look at what research it actually did. One of the things, the first thing is like, okay, I recommend the Turso libsql. So it would be like, okay, you have Mac1, you have the tracker, which is an embedded replica. It syncs with the primary DB and it syncs with another Mac. In terms of implementation, it gives you an idea of like how it would think about the implementation. And well, it gives you pricing information. So the second one is rsync, which I'm not sure about how that would work actually, because how we can connect Macs in an easy way via SSH, I don't know.
Looks pretty tedious, right?
Yeah. I think, for example, this part, I think it did a lot of assumptions, like, or SSH access between machines. So probably like this didn't went into like details probably around like how this SSH access went, which we could like right now here. Like,
do you think if you had a different setup on the amount of questions that it would ask, it would have asked you about this or not really?
Probably yes. Like if you go through the verbose mode, it will ask you like, okay, maybe I have like these researchers that I'm figuring out, and you might say, okay, I would prefer to deep dive on option X or Y, no? And then, well, this option 3, it's essentially pushing code edits, and then have like yeah. So probably like it would be interesting to deep dive a little bit on the Turso one. Let's say Okay, it did some sources, and here's like the interesting part. No, you have the open questions like conflict resolution. With append only data, conflicts are minimal, but what if the same commit is locked on two machines before sync? And likely,
right?
Yeah.
It's impossible, right?
Actually, I guess like if you're starting from the same thing,
And how would you have the same commit? You will have different commits. The SHA will be different, right?
well, if I don't know if you perform the exact same like text change starting from the same point, is it like deterministic enough that the next commit will be the same or not? I don't know if that's something like.
Sounds sketchy.
Yeah.
That sounds like a lot of conflicts in a big code base.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe this is like, you can leave a comment here. It's like, okay, let's consider this, no, and let's focus on this. And Turso supports importing. Turso's Python SDK offline writes are still in beta. Is this a blocker? For most usages, sync before write is acceptable. Offline writes are still in beta. I don't know exactly what it means. So you can even ask like, not sure what you mean with this.
Why do you think it chose Turso?
Yeah. Let's say recommendation. Design for exactly this use case, local first SQLite. Python SDK. Here, there's one thing that it might have not considered, which was not considered from the start, which is, let's go to the recommendation and say, okay, Turso makes sense, but how can we know when, let's say differently. If I want to see the tracker filtered by a user of the CLI, example, machine A versus B, how it would work. So let's say that we are fine with these questions, and I will actually, sorry, where it was here. How it would work if I want to see stats filtered by machine. And I will also mention that Turso seems like the reasonable approach for deep diving. And once I save and quit the file reviewer, you will see here that it actually returned the exact comments that I did in which lines and which parts of the research. No? And this is pretty interesting because you can see here that it will start asking me questions for each of the comments that we left. No? So it asks me different things. So I will say expand the Turso section so that we disregard the other one. So we deep dive on that one. Let's see. Okay, so that's a good point. How you want to see which machine contributed to it. So yeah, actually, like this is one of an interesting points. No, like do we want to kind of like add a new column or have different databases? I guess like having different databases like goes completely against of the Turso approach. So probably like let's keep. Actually, I will put it. I would go for one, but make it backward compatible as nullable or something. And then, yeah, here it's like document this approach. That looks good.
It's interesting that the file review is a skill, right? And not a tool.
Yes. Well, actually, here it's using like there's two skills. Like there's the skill of file review, which is the one that it's using, like the one that it used initially, which is the skill to actually figure out what files you are working on and the tool that you need to use, which is like the file review binary, and then what will happen once that review is done. And that comes with another skill that is the one that is kind of like one that is called process comments, which explains how you should tackle and address the comments, saying you should be using this tool, the ask user question tool, so like you can have a better UX on reviewing these comments, and then how the whole kind of like loop should then follow up on those ones. No, because like the first thing that it does is follow up on each of the questions, and once it gets the context on those, it will like figure out what needs to be changed in the research and do that, right? So it's not that you need to kind of like answer one, wait for that to be done, and then so on. Also, it's interesting because it will potentially group different questions in the same kind of like point. No, if you make like redundant comments or something like that, it will say, okay, these 3 comments apply to the same topic, and it will figure out the best question to ask to tackle all of those questions.
When I was a junior engineer, I was the tedious guy saying same as above all the time.
Yeah,
I guess you wrote this for those guys.
exactly. Actually,
Lovely.
in fact, it works like that, right? Like sometimes I say I do exactly that. So even like you leave a comment and then you see something that is related to it is like same as the previous comment, and it will figure it out. Like it gives you a really kind of like human kind of like feedback loop. The same way as you would go for a like design document RFC where you would leave comments to appear and they would follow up async or not async. This would be more of like when you leave comments on a PRD and then you have a Slack conversation around that with the person that leave the comments. Like I have the feeling that that is the most similar thing in terms of like when you have interaction with humans. No? So it also like mimics this so that it feels more natural for you as a someone that is like prompting the agent, and also like I guess from the agent also it's useful because in the end of the day probably it's trained much more in this type of interaction or this type of like setups.
Nice. Okay, so we have one more question. Hopefully we can finish up the research soon.
Yeah.
How many research are you running in parallel usually?
This is one interesting thing, which is that performing researches and then the next step would be creating plans. But performing researches is something that it's highly parallelizable because you can like have at the same point multiple researchers both in the same project, obviously in different projects. There's no limit at all. But in the same project, you might have like different researchers at the same time on different topics. And also you might even, what I like to do sometimes is saying, okay, I want to have a section on like future enhancements or like things that I don't want to kind of like pollute the current research on, but like have like the pointers for them, and then have a new research that what it does is, okay, I want to research this topic of this other research. So it's like something that it not only it's completely fresh, but it connects to previous researchers and to other things, no? And all this connection feels really useful. Also, like as you have more and more of them, it has like a more cohesive like understanding of what you want to do and what you've been doing and so on.
Is it possible to connect the research so that actually I look into my user data, like to check my DB or to check my Sentry, or is it possible to get all that information into my research?
Yeah, definitely. Like in fact, right now, how the research is done is mostly focused on using, for example, like web search or these kind of like tools. But definitely, like one of the things that you could do is get that and see what are the like MCPs or tools or whatever like data sources that might be relevant to your use case, and have that as part of like the research. Like for example, I definitely can see a really interesting example where if you have like issues going on in production or something like that, and you want to kind of like to be able to fix those issues if the issues are not like trivial, to be able to say, okay, this is the issue that you want to fix. You want to do a research on like why is it happening and so on, and maybe you have like a Sentry MCP and you say, hey, use this MCP to get like information about the issue or like relevant issues or like similar ones on how they were resolved. So you connect also like the GitHub tools or MCP, and you might have that definitely as part of the research. In fact, it's a really good idea that currently the research that we use is much more basic in that sense, but it's something that you can enhance really easily, especially with skills where you can say like, okay, use also these skills for this thing or this other thing and so on.
And it seems we're reaching the end of the research and also the end of this video. So it would be great if we can review a bit of the research that we built right now and how is it looking before we start the implementation.
Yes. So to do that, what I will do is ask file review again, and this is like the way to do it like manually. Like say, hey, file review this. By default, the research, if you select the option of file review, it will do it automatically. So yeah, that one. But you can always say it manually, and this is a shortcut for the CLI. Now,
by the way, I see my research in anti-gravity, but don't tell anyone.
Let's have a quick look on this. So the current architecture remains the same. So it here went into detailed implementation. So add a nullable machine ID column to track the device. Add as nullable for backward compatibility. That makes sense. Okay, it used like a machine ID env variable. That makes sense to me. Then also like makes it as feature flag to some extent, because if you don't have the Turso database URL, it would just work as it works right now. So it makes it backward compatible. So that's also really nice. And it even mentioned some of the changes that we need to do on the write and update query functions. Okay. And for the CLI, it added a new sync command, and for the stats, it mentioned about the machine one, so that makes sense. And there's a machine command. Okay. Migration path, and then it kept the other options, which is fine. It went through the recommendation. Historical context. This is actually really interesting, which actually referred to a previous research that we did. I think this is literally the first one. And it even mentioned unrelated project research, which that's also nice. Some sources and the open questions. This is really interesting too, because for each of the open questions that we asked, it actually gave some specific answers and solutions. Well, in this case, yeah, the conflict resolution, the migration, the offline rights. So yeah, I guess this research looks good to me, and I think like we can create a pretty decent plan out of it. So,
that sounds like our next video. Thank you so much, Taras. Have a wonderful day. And if you reach this point with us, then check out the documentation. We're going to be sharing this research, and we're going to be creating a plan out of it in our next video. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.